Okay, so today we're going to talk about the rise of the Axis powers. And we already talked about how in Europe in the 1920s and parts of Asia, there were dictators rising to power. And the reason that dictators rose to power is because there was a really unstable economic situation across Europe, especially right after World War One. Countries were broke, economies were collapsing, people were jobless, and they were getting desperate. So when dictators came in and offered stronger leadership and made a bunch of phony promises, they bought into it and decided to give up on democracy. We already talked about Germany, where Hitler took over in the 1930s, and Italy, where Benito Mussolini took over in the early 1920s. The place we haven't talked about yet is going to be the third big Axis power during World War II. These guys are all going to be in a military alliance together. And that's Hideki Tojo from Japan, who ends up kind of wrestling power away as the military commander of the Japanese army. Now, the first nation to really make a move in the years leading up to World War II is Japan. Japan, obviously being an island nation, you're going to run out of resources eventually. And they knew that there was a big part of China called Manchuria that was very rich in natural resources that they could use. So they went in, they took it over, they had a superior military, and nobody really did anything about it. Now, there was a peacekeeping organization called the League of Nations that was created right after World War I. The problem with the League of Nations is that even though Woodrow Wilson came up with it, and Woodrow Wilson was obviously the President of the United States at the time, the United States Congress never approved of us joining the League. So without the United States as a member, the League was pretty weak. So when Japan went in and attacked part of China, everyone just kind of looked at each other and said, well, what do we do? And nobody wanted to make a definitive move because they were too afraid that they were going to get involved in a war. Japan just decides to drop out of the League of Nations. The League said a few things to them they didn't like. They said, you can't invade other countries. So they said, fine, we don't want to listen to your rules. You're not going to punish us anyway. We're just going to drop out. 2 years later, when Adolf Hitler takes over, Germany does the same thing. They say, hey, if Japan doesn't have to be in the League, then I guess we don't either. And then Adolf Hitler and Germany make an even bigger move in 1935 when they start to build up their military. Now, this was a violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I. The agreement was that Germany was only allowed to have a certain number of soldiers. Their navy, their air force had to be kept extremely limited, and supposedly the League of Nations was supposed to go in there and check up on Germany and make sure they weren't doing a military buildup. And if they were, then it was the League's responsibility to stop them. So in 1935, just like Japan had tested the League, Germany tested the League. And the League of Nations does really nothing when Germany starts to build up their military. Italy sees what Japan and Germany had done, and they say, all right, well, if this one group who's supposed to stop us from acts of aggression isn't actually going to do that, then maybe we should try to take some land of our own. So Italy tests the League of Nations in 1935 as well. They go and they invade Ethiopia, which is a nation in Africa. The reason they do that, Ethiopia had a weak government, a weak military, and it was extremely rich in natural resources, just like Manchuria had been for the Japanese. Once again, the League of Nations has a very weak response. So let's look at the U.S. reaction to this, because since the United States wasn't in the League of Nations, they could kind of do their own thing. And they really decided they wanted to stay out of this. They didn't want to obviously help Japan, Germany, or Italy because they didn't agree with what those nations were doing. But they definitely wanted to stay out of any looming conflict. So they passed a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts in 1935. And the main thing this accomplished was if you were a nation at war, you could not buy weapons, you could not get loans from the United States. So it cut out any aggressive countries out of U.S. weapons and money, which a lot of people relied on. especially since the economic situation was so desperate in many parts of Europe and Asia at the time. Between 1936 and 1939, there's an important event that happens in Spain. The Fascist Party, the same party that had taken over in Italy more than a decade before, led by Benito Mussolini, the fascists were now taking over in Spain, and they were led by a fascist general called Francisco Franco. So he overthrows the Spanish Republic, and the reason this is really important is because not only because there's another dictatorship that rises to power in Europe, but Germany and Italy both decided to help Franco do this. They sent weapons and they sent soldiers. This was the first time that Germany and Italy had really worked together, and this is going to be really the foundation of the Axis powers that comes together in World War II. And then Germany just starts going in and taking over place after place. We'll try to go through this kind of quickly. The first place Hitler decides to invade is Austria in March of 1938. The reason he does this, he has a few reasons. Austria is close. Austria had been stripped of most of its territory. We know that in World War I, Austria was part of something larger called Austria-Hungary. And now it's just a little measly, weak nation. And he figured the people of Austria might want to join up with Germany. So he kind of didn't look at it as conquering Austria. He looked at it as unifying Germany and Austria. And a lot of the people in Austria bought into that. As you can see, they're given the Nazi salute when the Nazis marched in. So there was very little resistance by the Austrians. And if I didn't already mention it, this was also where Hitler was born. He was raised in Austria before he moved to Germany a little later in his life. So there's a map of pre-World War II Europe. Just to show you what things look like. That map is going to look extremely different pretty soon. We already know that Austria now become part of Germany. So in September 1938, Hitler does the same thing he did in Austria. This time he goes into Western Czechoslovakia because it's close. And one of the other reasons he claimed he was going into these countries was that there were a lot of German people in there, a lot of German speaking people with German traditions, German heritage. And he claimed that the governments of Czechoslovakia and Austria were actually persecuting these people and treating them like garbage. He claimed he had to go in to protect them, which this was all made up. France and Great Britain started getting a little concerned about all this, especially because this is happening in their neighborhood in Europe. So they set up a meeting to meet in Munich, Germany, called the Munich Conference, and there's a picture from it right there. They appease Hitler at this conference. Hitler explains to them how he's trying to protect his people. He won't take any more territory. He got him what he wanted. They really buy into this, and they say, all right, you can keep the territory as long as you don't take anything else. And he gives them his pledge that he's done with conquest. But in March of 1939, he takes over all of Czechoslovakia. And moving east, if he keeps going too far, he knows he's going to run into the huge world superpower with the Soviet Union, who has a massive military. He doesn't want to step on their toes at this point in time, so he signs a non-aggression pact with them, simply stating that they won't interfere with the Soviet territory as long as the Soviets don't interfere with their territory. It's not a military alliance, but they agree they want to attack each other. A second part of the agreement, a secret agreement, was that they would split Poland in half, since Poland was right between them. Germany would invade from the west, and the Soviets would invade from the east. They'd create a border in the middle, and they wouldn't mess with that border. Germany especially attacked so quickly that they called this a new type of warfare called Blitzkrieg, or translates over to lightning war in English. It's a German word. After this, France and Great Britain say, we've had enough. We can't let everyone go crazy and take over all of Europe, so they declare war against Germany. Here's a map just showing you what Europe looked like by June of 1940. There was a march into France. France wasn't prepared to fight, even though they had declared war months earlier in 1939. So Germany had taken over France. All the countries with X's were now taken over by Germany. All the countries who are underlined were part of the Axis powers with Germany. And the Soviet Union had also done some conquest of their own. You can see where the hammer and the sickle are, and those countries that are circled, in addition to Eastern Poland, those had all fallen to the Soviet Union. So we got big problems here. Well, there's a guy, Winston Churchill, who is now in charge of the United Kingdom. And he had been saying all along, even before he was the Prime Minister, you've got to stop Hitler in his tracks. You can't keep giving in to his demands because he's just going to want more. So now finally he's in charge, and he's going to play an important role in keeping morale up when Britain is actually attacked. So the island of Britain is being bombed by the Germans for probably 5 to 6 months between the summer and the fall of 1940. It's called the Battle of Britain. A lot of damage is done to the island, but it never falls. And eventually Hitler was losing so many planes that he didn't surrender because he was on the offensive, but he decided to withdraw for a while and refocus his war efforts elsewhere. It was a great speech by Winston Churchill, something that you can listen to there. You can look it up on YouTube. It's the Winston Churchill Fight on the Beaches speech. When things were looking really bad for Britain, he boosted morale. He said, we have to fight and defend this island at all costs. And it really helped. June of 1941, this was the biggest mistake that Germany makes, probably during the war. For their strategy, they decided to attack the Soviet Union. They had a non-aggression pact. They didn't have to do this, but what it came down to is Adolf Hitler really just didn't trust Joseph Stalin, and he felt that if he didn't attack him first, he would eventually be attacked by the Soviets. And this ended up really coming back to bite the Germans, having to fight the Soviets throughout World War II. Just a few things about the U.S. path to war. We still wanted to stay out of things, even though our friends in France and the United Kingdom were in big trouble. So we passed a cash and carry policy. It was the best we could do at the time. We agreed that if the United Kingdom came over to the U.S. and paid for weapons in hard cash, no loans, and they carried them back in their own ships, we would give them weapons. But that was the only way, because those were some pretty strict restrictions. Eventually, that would turn to the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, where we would just start loaning them weapons, because eventually they ran out of money. Military draft in 1940. Before we were even involved in the war, we decided to start building our military through a draft, just in case we get pulled in. Things weren't looking good, so eventually that's what we decided to do. The Lend-Lease Act I talked about, there was a Japan trade embargo. We didn't like what Japan was doing over in Asia. After they conquered Manchuria, they went over and they conquered a lot more territory in that specific area. So to try to stop them, we set up a trade embargo with other countries, meaning we wouldn't let supplies get in or get out. Eventually, they started to have a shortage of fuel, gasoline, and oil. This is a big problem, and Japan is going to react pretty harshly to that, as we'll find out in the next slide. We start to work a little bit with Stalin and the Soviet Union. The famous quote by FDR on this is, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." We had to decide who was the bigger threat at the time, and we decided that Germany was the bigger threat. And we decided to work a little closer with the Soviet Union, and we actually started to give them some weapons as well. So here's where Japan gets back at us for the trade embargo that was leaving them with fuel shortages. They do a surprise attack on our naval base in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Franklin Roosevelt calls it a date that will live in infamy. You can see the statistics there. A big part of our naval fleet was destroyed. Part of our Air Force was destroyed. We lost a lot of equipment, lost a lot of men and women. One of the worst attacks on U.S. soil, right up there with 9/11. This is going to be the event that pulls us into the war. Immediately after this, Franklin Roosevelt gives his declaration of war speech. Just to give you an idea of what we were up against at the time. So we're fighting against Japan. Obviously, when you declare war against Japan, and they're in a military alliance with the other Axis powers, mainly Germany and Italy, you have a war against at least all three, plus the other minor Axis powers. Here's what Japan's empire looked like in early 1942. It's no joke there. It's a lot of territory, a lot of people under the control of the Japanese, and quite a few islands out there. Just to give you an idea of what a world war actually looks like. All the countries in green and blue were involved in World War II at some point before the war ended. Whether they sent some weapons over, some soldiers, they had some kind of role, maybe some money. So this was truly a world war. The countries in gray are the only ones who didn't get involved. And that's the end of that presentation. Hopefully you have a better understanding of the Axis powers and some of the steps they took leading up to the war and then early in the war as they were on the offensive.